All right, once again, I know our first run around was didn't quite work out well for everybody, but this time you sound great. Thank you very much for joining us. Once again, this is Alex Riley, a Republican that represents part of Springfield in the Missouri House of Representatives. Sir, first of all, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And you represent the Missouri 134th. Can you tell us where that is?
Sure. So that is it's really a little skinny sliver of South and Central Springfield. So on the south end, it starts at the Christian County line. It's bordered on the east by Campbell until you get up to Seminole. Then it takes Seminole over to National. And the northern boundary is the Phelps Grove Park area. And then on the west side, it kind of cuts around all over, but is more or less bordered by Golden on the west side. So it's just this really skinny sliver of Springfield. It's actually one of the smallest House districts in geographic size in the entire state, but it's very densely populated. But kind of an interesting thing that we have one of the smaller House districts in Springfield as far as geographic size goes.
So, hey, congratulations is in order. This is you just got elected this past November, and you got sworn in when? Like what was the day you got sworn in on?
We got sworn in on January 6th, which, as you all probably recall, was eventful and will probably go down in U.S. history for some rather unfortunate reasons. And that's the day that we saw the really horrific and tragic storming of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C.
Before we get into today's whole rigmarole, was that the most insane day of your life? I mean, that's got to be a career high, being elected the way you have been, while also being elected on such a tragic, historic day. What was it like on that day for you?
Yeah, so it was kind of wild, to be honest, because as you might expect, I wasn't super plugged into my phone and the news and what was going on during the day for most of the day. So it was actually as we were getting sworn in, it was either shortly before we got sworn in or shortly after we got sworn in, there was another House member who stood up on the floor and made these comments about some horrific, tragic events going on at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. and stood and asked for a moment of silence from all the House members. And very few of us really knew what was going on. And at that point, it was a very fluid situation. So there wasn't a lot of real concrete news on what truly was happening. But it was both tremendously exciting personally for what was happening, but then hearing this extremely concerning situation going on at the Capitol, which frankly, we haven't seen something like that happen there since the British burned the place down in the War of 1812, was, you can imagine the conflicting emotions, certainly.
Any safety issues, any safety concerns for you folks there at the Capitol Hill in Jefferson City?
There have not been any issues. There were some concerns and rumors of issues, both on the governor's inauguration day, which happened give or take a week after we in the House got sworn in. And so that we had a heightened security presence on inauguration day, and that went off without a hitch. There were no issues whatsoever. And then there were also some concerns, some rumors of issues on President Biden's inauguration day, and we saw nothing. I think there was one guy with a sign out on the front yard, which is not the front yard of the Capitol, and that's not unusual. So no, we've had no real security issues at all at the Missouri Capitol, which has certainly been encouraging for us here.
Well, we didn't bring you in to talk about that. How can you not talk about it though? But we brought you to talk about yourself. What got you into what you're doing now? What is your day-to-day job like? Why identify with the Republican Party and not some other party? Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So we'll start off with your first question. So I've been active in politics nearly my entire life, kind of strangely. I first got involved in politics when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old. And I got really interested in a United States Senate race that was going on in Missouri at the time. It was a 2002 race between an individual named Jim Talent, and then the U.S. Senator at the time was a Democrat named Gene Carnahan. And I got really interested in Jim Talent's campaign, his policy positions and views, and asked my parents as an 11, I think I was 11 at the time, if I could go sign up to help the soon-to-be Senator Talent's campaign. And my family was not political at all. Like, my parents would vote, we would chat about politics at the dinner table and things like that, but we weren't by any means political activists. But there was something about what was going on in the country at that time, which as students of history, you all would know, was shortly after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. So that was certainly a key moment in my growing up years and forming my political beliefs and ideologies and philosophies on how the world works and should work. So after I had convinced my parents to let me go work on Senator Talent's campaign, I went door to door campaigning for him. He was successful in that election, and at that point I was kind of hooked on politics. So I worked on a campaign, basically at least one campaign, if not more than one campaigns, every election cycle between then and then ultimately when I left the state for a short time to go on to law school. So always had this really, really deep interest in politics. Didn't necessarily plan on running for office at the time that I did. To be honest, growing up, while I was always interested in politics, I was also always interested in military service. So these two ideas of working to serve the country, protect the country and the citizens that live here. So that was always my plan growing up. Though when I was 17, I was diagnosed with cancer. So at that point, that changed my whole career trajectory, because obviously even with a good result, there would be some recovery time and I wouldn't be able to meet the military's physical requirements for quite a while. So at that point, really switched gears, ended up doing my bachelor's in kind of an unconventional way. I tested out a 3/4 worth of my college classes when I was in high school. Graduated with my bachelor's when I was 19, and always still had this real interest that I wanted to do something in politics, but realizing at 19 I was probably too young and not necessarily qualified to run for anything, and also realizing that I did want to earn some income, and there aren't a lot of political jobs, especially entry-level political jobs, that allow you to earn an income. So I ended up taking a job as a paralegal at a law firm for about a year. Really enjoyed working in the law. That seemed to mesh well with my interest in law and policy. So ultimately decided to go on to law school, went to law school over in Illinois, and then came back to Springfield to practice law. Well, and still being very active in politics and the political process. So I started to develop the thought that, well, maybe it would be an interesting time to run for office. We had some House seat vacancies coming up in the Springfield area, and started looking around at what was going on in the country, and I frankly developed some real concerns. And this will be a little bit controversial, but I think you all deserve to know my thoughts and where I stand on things, and how I think about issues, and what really made me decide to run. So my wife and I had been thinking about running for a while, and there were some things going on in states around the country that really caught my attention. So the first happened in New York about, it's been a couple years ago now, and you all probably remember this, but they passed in my view, a rather extreme abortion law that allows the termination of pregnancies basically up until the point of birth. And at the time that law was being passed, my wife was 8 months pregnant at the time with our first child. And as I was sitting there watching the news that night, hearing about the abortion law that had been passed in New York, I like a lot of new dads do, I had my hand sitting there on my wife's tummy, and I was feeling my not yet born son kicking and squirming around inside her tummy, and he was starting to hiccup. And all while I'm feeling this, Governor Cuomo is talking about what a great day this is for health in the state of New York and ordering the World Trade Center lit up in pink. And that just really troubled me, because what they were doing is they were talking about how it would be okay to terminate the life of a child that was the exact same age as my unborn son, who I could feel kicking and squirming and wiggling around inside my wife. And it really struck me that's what they're saying is they're saying that that's not a human life, which is just feeling what I can feel. I know that's not true. Or they're saying that's a human life and we don't care. And with my views and feeling what I could see, that was just a completely unacceptable thing to me. So that started the gears turning even more, that, well, maybe now is the time to stand up and fight for some of the things that we believe in. And then a couple of days later, the governor of Virginia commented on a law that they had going through their system at the time, and suggested that it would be okay to terminate a child even after that child had been born. And that caused me even greater concern, because it wasn't that long ago Virginia had a similar political makeup to Missouri, but there had been a real radical transformation there in just a few years. And it struck me that if people like me don't stand up and fight for the things that we believe in, then we could have a similar result happen in Missouri that we've seen in Virginia. So while that social aspect, those social issues, were probably the thing that really drove me into the race right now at this time, that kind of created this sense of urgency. Social issues aren't necessarily my real passion and the reason, the things that I'm working on up here. So I'm personally more focused on economic issues. As you all know, being in our hometown of Springfield, we have a lot of economic opportunity, but we have really high poverty rates, in excess of 25%. And it's interesting and troubling how we can have such low unemployment rates, but extremely high poverty rates. So that suggests that in Springfield, we have a lack of really good, high paying jobs, of family supporting jobs. So one of my primary focuses in the House has been doing things to improve the overall economic climate of the state, and specifically doing things to try and recruit more high paying jobs to come to Missouri, and then Springfield in particular. Doing things to provide individuals the tools they need to go out and obtain better paying jobs. So what does that look like? So for me, there are a few things that I'm personally working on. I filed a few bills that deal with regulation issues. So doing things to reduce government regulations on our business community, such that they're able to grow and hire individuals without dealing with some of the government red tape that really impedes their ability to do so. Doing things to make sure that we have a fair and efficient tax structure, one that doesn't impede growth, but also ensures that the state has the revenue it needs to provide the essential services that we need to provide our citizens as a state. And I'm sure we could probably talk a little bit more in detail about that here in a little bit, if you all are interested. And then also a real passion of mine, with being in addition to my role in the legislature, I'm also an attorney in Springfield. One of the interesting things that I'm sure you all know, with being in Mr. Crocker's class, is that we have a part-time legislature in Springfield that frankly doesn't pay a whole lot. And so for those of us who have families, we still need to have jobs outside of our role here in order to take care of and provide for our families. So I've maintained my law practice while being here in the legislature. And specifically what I do is I protect our businesses of all shapes and sizes when they get sued. So with that perspective and working with our business community every day, it's become readily apparent that we have a legal structure in Missouri. So when a business gets sued, the businesses are basically at a disadvantage in our court system right now because of our procedural rules, and there are some other things that we can get into later if the class wants to, that more or less stack the deck against our businesses, and that's a real impediment to our economic climate here. So doing things to make that system more fair, so that's making sure that when individuals are hurt, they can still recover, make sure they're made whole as best money can do when they get hurt, but also ensuring that we aren't swung too far in that direction, that we have a fair legal system that allows the defense to have its day in court as well. So doing things here in the Capitol to reform that system, make it more fair. Some other things that are of interest, workforce development is key. As you all know, there are jobs available in high paying industries, but there is a lack of well-trained people to go in and fill those jobs. So supporting things like the new advanced manufacturing center that is currently being built there at OTC, that's key to me. I think that's going to have an extremely beneficial impact on Springfield and our Southwest Missouri community, and training individuals to go into those advanced manufacturing industries that tend to be better paying jobs. Encouraging people to go into the trades. So for some people, going on and getting a 2-year, 4-year degree is the perfect fit. For others, it's not a great fit, and encouraging folks like that to go into the trades where they can go and earn a pretty good income right out of high school without having to incur that college student debt loan burden is also a high priority of mine. So those are a few of the things that I'm currently working on in the House on the economic front. And then kind of in that same vein, and I'll shut up here in just a second and we can go into some more questions, would be education reform. So that's been a major focus of the House this year. It's one of the Speaker of the House's top priorities is education reform. So we've passed 2 pretty high profile and frankly somewhat, depending on who you ask, extremely controversial bills dealing with education reform so far this session. The first one, and interestingly, both of them only passed by 1 vote. So you have to have 82 votes to pass something in the Missouri House of Representatives. There are 163 members, and you have to have a pure majority of those 163 members vote yes in order to pass a bill into law, and that number is 82. So one of those bills we passed out of the House yesterday, and what it does is it allows open enrollment for public schools. So basically what that means is that a student can attend any public school he or she wants. They're not limited to just attending the public school that is the one in their district. So if they're stuck in a district that has a really terrible public school system, but they're close to a district that has a good one, they're allowed to go to that better school district in order to further their education needs and make sure that they're receiving the best education training possible. So that's the idea behind that one. The other one, which was perhaps even more controversial, established something called education savings accounts. And the way that works is an account is opened up at the state treasurer's office. Individuals, businesses, other entities are allowed to make contributions into this account. And then those businesses, individuals, in turn receive a tax credit. So the money that's in this education savings account is then allowed to be used by parents and families to help fund their children's education. And I can't remember, it's been a few weeks since we passed it. I think the amount is $5,600, something like that, that a family per student, $5,600 per student, that a family is allowed to take from that education savings account and use for whatever type of education training they see fit. So for example, if their student is in a public school and that is just not working for them, and they think that maybe a private school option would be better, they're allowed to use that $5,600 to help get that student who's struggling and not doing well in that setting and place them and use that to help cover the private school tuition. Or if a student is in a public school and they like public school, perhaps they're extremely involved in the extracurricular activities, or they have a lot of friends, or for whatever reason they want to stay there, but they feel like some additional training, some additional instruction might be helpful, they're allowed to use money from that education savings account to go out and hire tutors or something along that line to help provide better education instruction for the students. And there are a whole bunch of other things you can do with that education savings account, but the idea is to provide families and more importantly, individual students more options to better be able to tend to their educational needs. So one more comment about the education reform thing that's extremely interesting to me is you see some really interesting coalitions forming in the legislature to get these items across the finish line. These are not Republican Democrat votes. You have really interesting combinations of Republicans and Democrats joining together to get these education reform things across the finish line. So you typically see Republicans in the more urban areas join with Democrats in the more urban areas that perhaps don't have or perhaps have some concerns about the quality of the public schools, joining together to create these education opportunity bills. So it's kind of interesting just seeing how those various coalitions form. And one thing perhaps we can talk about here in a little while is, or maybe now, is a lot of what we do in the House isn't especially partisan. So the things that make the headlines, the things that are in the news leader, those tend to be partisan, but most of the bills that we end up passing are not necessarily Republican versus Democrat issues. You do see a lot of bills that pass with overwhelming bipartisan support, which I think is pretty cool and really sets us apart, I think, from what you see happening at the national level, where it's just all strictly party politics. You don't see a whole lot of joining together to try and do things that really benefit the state as a whole or the country as a whole there in Washington, D.C. But we do that pretty often here in Jefferson City. There are some issues, of course, that Republicans and Democrats just aren't ever going to agree on. But there are a lot of things that we do come together and form various coalitions to get things done, which I think is really cool. So I've been rambling for a long time, so I'll shut up and I'll let Mr. Crocker redirect and see where we want to go at this point.
Well, you have already given, thank you for that statement. You have already given us quite a bit to go on, but nonetheless, could you give us a thesis statement here? Why do you identify with the Republican Party and not some other political party?
Yeah, appreciate that. And you mentioned that earlier, so thanks for redirecting. I would say it really, again, the formation of my political ideology started around that September 11th timeframe. I was about to turn 10, I think, when those attacks happened, and those events really drew me in and really opened up my eyes to pay attention to what was going on in the world around me and not just in my own little circle of the things that I was interested in. So at that time, as you probably might recall, Republicans were more or less in power across the board, at least at the federal level. And there was a real strong emphasis on national security, protecting our country, its citizens. And that there was a real focus there from the Republican Party about that being a real central plank. So that was something I identified with as a 10-year-old and seeing what was going on. And that resonated, saying, okay, yeah, we do need to make sure that protecting our country at home and abroad is a priority. And then as I grew older and started to look into more issues than just that, I started to really realize where my focus and my philosophies lie. And it really starts with limited government. So and not necessarily in contrast, but in conjunction with that, empowering the individual to have the freedom to do what he or she wants to do. And I will be the first to admit, and I call it out frequently, that while the Republican Party platform stands for these things, all too often Republican politicians don't. So you will never, I will certainly criticize that all day long. So, but I'm just going to comment on focusing on the party stand itself, and I'm certainly willing to comment on other things if there are questions. But you won't ever hear me say that the Republican Party is perfect and gets it right all the time. So so those are a couple of things that I think the Republican platform does a better job focusing on than other party platforms. Again, things that I talked about, like educational opportunity, that, or at school education reform, school choice, that tends to be more of a Republican Party platform issue, though Democrats do join on that, and plenty of Republicans oppose that plank of the platform. But I firmly adhere to that. Doing things to improve the economic climate, I think the Republican view makes more sense with that. With getting government out of the way and allowing those businesses, the innovators, the job creators, to have the freedom to do and to hire people, to innovate, to do what they need to do to be successful. Another item, and again, this is one that Republicans have failed miserably on, especially at the federal level in recent years, is fiscal responsibility. Ensuring that the government is spending only what it has. And again, this has been one of the greatest frustrations and greatest failings of Republicans at the federal level for a very long time, and I will never defend them for this. But fiscal responsibility is more of a plank in the Republican platform. You don't hear that as much in the Democrat platform. Those are a few things. One other item that I'll mention there also would be the interpretation of the Constitution. So, and again, this is an issue where Republicans do fail from time to time when it fits their narrative, and it's extremely frustrating. But I believe in a textualist interpretation of the Constitution, and that means basically that the words of the Constitution mean what they say. We shouldn't be reading in a bunch of whole new rights and ideas and saying that the Constitution protects these things and says these things when it in fact doesn't. I think the Constitution should be applied literally, and that's more or less an explanation of what that philosophy is. And that's a more Republican philosophy. The other parties tend to believe that the Constitution is more of a living document that should fluctuate with the times, and we can read it to include new rights and things like that aren't necessarily there. So those are a few reasons that I more identify as a Republican than another party, perhaps.
So we had several dozen questions submitted for you, sir, and I'd like to get to a lot of them. I do want to comment on something you said a moment ago, because we actually haven't talked. We don't talk a lot about state government, oddly enough, in these government classes. We talk federal government. But you mentioned how the legislature in Missouri is part-time. That means you guys are gathering, voting, considering bills January through June. Is that typically what you guys do? And then you're off the rest of the year?
So it's January through the middle of May. We will be done the second week of May with the regular session. Then we will have a veto session in September, and that's just a one-day session where, should the governor veto any of the bills that we pass out of the House and Senate, then we as the House and Senate will have the opportunity to get together to decide if we're going to override the governor's veto and still pass those bills into law. So in order to do that, we have to have 2/3 of the House vote yes to override the veto, 2/3 of the Senate vote yes to override the veto. And so those are the two times that we are required by the Missouri Constitution to be in session. And then the governor has the power and ability to call us back into special session at any time he wants if he sees a particular issue that he believes needs to be addressed quickly outside of regular session. So this Governor Parson that we have currently has done that a few times over the years. It would not surprise me at all to see that happen again. Specifically, I would expect there to be some type of special session later in the summer to address how we're going to appropriate a lot of the new stimulus money that's coming down from the federal government with this latest stimulus plan. It's not entirely clear how much money the state is going to get and what exactly the instructions are going to be from the federal government on how that's to be spent. But we'll have to debate that later on this year and decide how we're going to allocate those resources to be spent in Missouri. So that's just an example, probably a special session we'll have this year. In previous years, the governor has called special sessions to address crime issues and COVID issues and things like that. But those are the events that will be in session. And then the rest of the time, we're not in session. We're back home in our districts with our families, working our day jobs if we have them. And for those who are blessed enough to be retired, they spend a lot of time on vacation.
Well, like I said, we got dozens of questions, but I do want to ask you real quick, just a question not asked by a student, because questions were submitted weeks ago. But yesterday, the Missouri House actually took it was either yesterday or the day before, they took a vote that has gotten a lot of national attention. As you know, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, allows states to opt in as to whether they want to expand Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor in their state. The people of Missouri voted to allow this to happen, to expand Medicaid. But yesterday or the day before, please clarify this vote for me. The House voted to not fund that. What exactly happened with that vote?
Sure. So great question. That was yesterday. And it wasn't the full House, it was the Budget Committee. And so I sit on the Budget Committee. So you've got the direct access to the thought process there. And I think we should have a good, robust discussion on that if Mr. Crocker and the class would like to do that. So let's just back up just a little more, talk about the history of the Medicaid expansion vote and then how we got to where we are today. And again, I do not expect anyone to necessarily agree with this, but I do want you to know the thought process. I think you all are entitled to know that. And feel free to push back vigorously if you so choose. So as you might remember, in August, during the primary vote in August, there was a measure on the ballot that was proposed to enter into this Medicaid expansion, as Mr. Crocker alluded to. So what that does is it expands the Medicaid population beyond what it's currently designed to serve, which is mostly focused on the poorest in our society, and it increased the number of individuals who would be able to enter into that program. So how it works is the federal government provides for 90% of the Medicaid expansion costs, but the state is still on the hook for 10% of those costs. It's been projected that the state share of that will be for the first year in the range of 150 million or so, give or take. And it will cost the state a few hundred million per year over the next few years. And then the hope is that it will ultimately break even, where it's not really costing the state anything, and then perhaps save the state money over time. those are the projections. It's not entirely clear to me that that's exactly accurate. We've seen in a lot of other states that have expanded Medicaid that hasn't been the actual result, that has cost the state a lot of money. But in any event, those are the projections. So the weird thing about that ballot initiative that makes it different from a lot of other initiatives is it included no language, no instruction whatsoever on how to pay for this Medicaid expansion. It didn't say that you're going to raise taxes to pay for it. It doesn't say you're supposed to cut funding from other sources in order to pay for it. It just left it blank. And which is a little concerning, a little troubling, because as you might know, in the state of Missouri, we are required to have a balanced budget. We aren't like the federal government where we can go into debt or print our own money. We have to have a balanced budget. So this caused some concern with the realization that there's this huge new program going to cost the state a lot of money, especially at the beginning, and no clear instruction on how to pay for it. There were some lawsuits filed during that campaign phase where individuals were trying to throw out that entire ballot measure because of not having any way to pay for it included in the ballot language, which is highly unusual when you're doing this type of program, because we also have rules in Missouri that we're not allowed to pass unfunded mandates into state law. So that means that you're not allowed to pass things and say you're going to have to do things without a way to pay for it. So there was this whole big court challenge where they were trying to, one segment was trying to get the whole thing thrown out and say this can't be on the ballot at all because of this unfunded mandate rule. And what the court ultimately said was, well, it seems to us that there is no real instruction here to the legislature that if it passes, you have to appropriate money. It's basically going to be at the discretion of the legislature as to whether you have to fund this thing or not. So this thing ends up ultimately getting passed. Somewhere around 53% of the voters who participated in that election voted yes on it. So fast forward to now, we're in this really strange situation where we have this language in the Constitution that's requiring Medicaid expansion and provides no real mechanism, no way to pay for it. That caused a lot of concern with the members of the Budget Committee that admittedly have a lot of philosophical problems with Medicaid expansion in general. And again, you don't have to agree with it, but one of those main concerns is this new population that we're talking about is primarily able-bodied men and women who are able to work and aren't for whatever reason. And whether it's a good policy for the state of Missouri to perhaps encourage those individuals not to go out and work and try and find perhaps better sources of healthcare than what Medicaid does. So there's this philosophical concern. Then there's the budgetary issue, and then there's the whole legal issue that we just discussed. So what happened yesterday then is there was a bill presented in the Budget Committee that would expand Medicaid. Ultimately, it came down to a strict party line vote where the Budget Committee said we're not going to recommend Medicaid expansion to the full House. We're not going to send out this separate bill to fund Medicaid expansion. What that doesn't mean is that it doesn't necessarily mean Medicaid expansion is totally dead, though I would think that is probably likely, at least given the current makeup of the House and Senate here in the state. What you will see next week is there will be a vote by the full House on this, and how that's going to look is that you will likely see Democrat members propose amendments to other budget bills that we will be debating to include Medicaid expansion in those budget bills. So there will continue to be debates on Medicaid expansion in the House, and then once the House passes the budget, sends it over to the Senate, you will see continued discussions and debate over Medicaid expansion in the Senate as well. So what happened yesterday doesn't end Medicaid expansion. It does probably signal where the Republican and majority view on this is here at the state capitol. But we're going to continue to have that debate over the course of the next few weeks. I hope hopefully that was kind of helpful.
I do want to let you know, thank you so much for being generous with your time. We got about 5 more minutes with you, and we got lots of student questions. So
okay,
let's do the best we can. You and I both long-winded people. Let's do the best we can to do a lightning round here, if that's okay.
Yes, let's do it.
We have a question it's a combo question from Taylor Kupta and Peyton Kiesling. They combined to ask, do you believe that Mike Parson has done the best he could during the COVID-19 pandemic? If so, what are things you'd like to do to make the pandemic easier? Why is lowering taxes a good practical idea to combat an economy that's been badly hurt by COVID-19?
Okay, so you cut out just a little bit, but I'm gonna go as fast as I can. So yes, overall, I do think Mike Parson has done a good job, which I think you can see when you compare Missouri's COVID rates to other states. We're doing very well right now. And then if you see how our economy is doing compared to other states, we're also doing much better economic wise than other states are. So yes, I have some, there are things that I would have liked to have seen done better, but overall, I think we've done a pretty good job here in Missouri, and I think the data bears that out.
Over spring break, which was last week for us, we sadly had 2 very high-profile shootings in America. Christopher Jones asked, you voted yes to not allowing enforcement of federal gun control. What do you think should be done about school shootings or just in general mass shootings?
Yeah. So specifically on that one bill that you talked about, so that bill doesn't preclude federal government from coming in and enforcing federal law. What it says is that the federal government cannot use state resources to enforce their federal gun laws. So there is a little bit of a difference there. The feds can still enforce their law. They just can't force the Greene County Sheriff to enforce their law and use state resources to enforce that law. So just a point of clarification, but yes, the point's well taken. As far as things to prevent school shootings, that is a tough question, and I think a lot of it seems to stem from mental health issues. It seems that all of these individuals, I can't think of a single high-profile example, maybe any example that I can think of, that didn't have some type of underlying mental health issue. So that seems to be the root of the problem, and I am in extreme favor of improving or increasing resources to combat that. And along those same lines, you're going to see something, we're going to be working on that here in the future in Missouri too, well, not in the very distant future, actually, to increase some resources to that end. So I think there's a bit of a reality here that when we're talking about a country where, like it or not, there's already at least 325 or so million guns floating around the country. There's probably more guns than people in the United States right now. I'm not sure that from just a practical perspective, even if you were to ban guns, all new guns tomorrow, that would really be a workable solution just because there are so many already out there. So I think the real focus is going to be trying to catch these individuals sooner and try and treat their underlying illnesses and issues.
You mentioned, this is Ivy Johnson. She says you mentioned in an interview with Ozarks Independent that you are pro-life. Matter of fact, you've talked about that today. Does this mean that under any circumstances that you think abortion is wrong? Or is there certain moments where you think pro-choice is more appropriate?
I appreciate that question too. And the only circumstance where I can fathom it being really potentially acceptable would be when you have a conflict over delivering the baby or the wife or the life of the mother is at stake. Every other instance, I'm always gonna side on the side of erring on the side of life. So that would be the only instance where you really have a policy choice of 2 lives involved, 2 lives at stake. And then I'm not totally convinced that it's the role of the state to decide which of those lives should take priority.
Sir, this is a great question. We're almost out of time. This is one of those instances I wish this could go on for 2 or 3 hours, but Brooke Enos asks, what are your thoughts on the issue of college debt?
Yeah, I really do appreciate that question. And I think that kind of piggybacks on something that I talked about earlier, which is that I think that we as a state, we as a society should do a much better job of not trying to funnel every single individual who graduates from high school into college. I don't think that that's a good fit for every single person. I think we need to do a much better job early at the high school level, maybe earlier, with trying to figure out if there are better economic opportunities for individuals that don't involve going into college and incurring that load of debt. So like I talked about, doing things to more focus on the trades, doing things to perhaps send more folks through through community colleges like where you all are. Those are all things that help decrease the overall debt load, and makes more sense for a lot of people than going on to incur thousands of dollars of student loan debt to only have the opportunity to obtain a fairly low wage job upon graduation.
Sir, again, thank you so much for your time. A little round of applause for our guest speaker today. Thank you so much. Best of luck going forward, and we can do this again sometime. Best of luck, sir.
Yes, absolutely. And if anyone else has any questions, don't hesitate to reach me on my personal cell phone. I don't mind taking calls anytime. So my personal cell phone number is 417-860-7555. If you have any questions about what's going on up here, don't hesitate to call. Or if you just don't like things I'm doing, feel free to call and let me know that too.
All right. Thank you again, sir. You take care.
Thank you. Appreciate it.